I was swinging today. I just grabbed the Cleveland and the Fullerton, and I just was comparing the two side by side, and I was hitting them both good. But for some reason, it was only spinning like 4 or 5 times per hour. That's and I put the same exact swing on the system. That was the same distance.
Yeah, I don't use my wedges that often.
See, that's the one I love.
The only measure you use Virginia. I'm within medium.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's a full swing. Like that, I don't. My 60 degree is like,
Well, actually,
I'll get your miss, you know.
I mean, it's like I had 80 yards actually. Full swing. I would either pretty much 80.
I think I have to hit a 60
degree or
like gap polish on it.
like a couch 60 degree.
Goes like 1, 5. But it's about anything 90 left for this. I try to get 60. So nothing goes in too much. It wasn't that exaggerated. Pause. Maybe like half this. Something pauses.
Did you see his video of how he has the paradigm?
Oh, like speaking of it. He's just on.
He's the first video.
Guys, yeah. See, speaking. I think like let's go. Yeah, I don't really. I literally said left by the look for you. Things now. I can't wait to hear. But you really it sounds like. Once we get some ground.
We're trying to a lot of muted. So that's like we're really pushing but oh yeah, it's well done. It's
Yeah, I certainly see. I have to pay that. I think it's just, you know, I think they make some words. I just want to sound like
I don't know. I like this.
you probably aren't careful saying her down actually. Yeah. Thank you. Never draw my life. Yeah, that's. Can I draw?
Well, that's how almost. It's like that's. I was playing. It's still like small. I mean, I don't see them like that expensive. I just. Here's- That to me is just crazy. It's just yeah. Let's stop it. Because it's full of gold. It's gonna make you better. Probably not fully with a lot of business things. So you 100. Yeah. I mean, it looks like you're on all this. You don't. You don't. So, what do you think? You trying to buy this? Really, could you make buy it? Honestly, with the block, you can use it sometimes. Crazy. I was so shocked on this song because it's still because I have the book. Yeah, must have just got me. It's like this isn't actually. Yeah, I'm not a fan of it. I would think rather than like. I would rather have a thing today. That was. I'm not designing light, I just don't know. Like this one, I don't like that. I'm just very clear, very specific. I like this one. That's pretty nice. That's the shape that my own is. But it doesn't fit them retractable. I'm so bad at retractable. And you would sometimes. You know, that's pretty cheap. Super track only $30 more. Or not $30 more. $30 a piece. Like, isn't that cheap? That one, yeah. It's but the only thing I don't like about that
balance my butter, I can scoop it all. And so like how those balance, I would so outside. But like, I don't want like top. One of the problems of my
Sit next.
Did you for your synergies?
Maybe your next actually like with the guest later. Like to get our NBA signed. Stress.
That's good.
All right, it's 4 o'clock, so I'm gonna start it.
Oh.
All right, good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing today? Pretty good. Doing good. All right, week 4, so time's flying. So usually by the end of week 4, that's when, things start to really speed up in the semester. That's when you guys have midterm starting and we're getting to that point. So we're leaving kind of early semester and approaching kind of mid semester. Okay, so the plan today is we're gonna go. This is I would say probably our last kind of pure biology lecture. So we've been going, for the past couple of weeks, we've been just going over biological stuff. So starting on Wednesday, we're actually gonna start doing some calculations. Okay. But today, we have to do one more biology lecture. Today is the subject is joints. Okay. A little bit different than bones and muscles, which is what we've been doing over the past couple weeks, but very, very important, especially as we start to do our static analysis starting next week. All right, so some announcements. Your homework 1 is graded, so I graded that earlier this afternoon. So the grade for that should be on Canvas. And homework 2 is posted as well. So homework 2 is posted on Canvas. Homework 2 is kind of a mix. I think it's kind of split 50-50 between just kind of conceptual biology questions. So I think there's a couple questions from muscles that we didn't quite get to in homework 1, and then some questions about joints. And then the majority of homework 2 is going to be more just kind of review in terms of static analysis, 3-body diagrams, force balances, moment balances, which is what we're going to review on Wednesday. All right, so take a look at homework 2. You should be able to get a decent start on it, definitely on the conceptual questions, and then as we go through the next couple of weeks. Okay, I think that's all my announcements. Are there any questions I can answer before we get started for today? Okay, all right, so let's go and get started. And so, like I mentioned, the topic for today is human joint biomechanics. All right, so when I say joints, I'm referring to any kind of interaction between 2 bones. It's basically where 2 bones meet in your body. Okay? And sometimes you'll see them called articulations, and so articulations is nothing more than just the interaction between two joints. Okay. So your joints are incredibly important when you're studying human biomechanics. Especially in this class where we're concerned mostly with human, right? And so as we learned, a couple weeks ago, your bones are very rigid. So you're not exactly going and bending your bones in half, right? And so the only way that you actually can perform movement is, the fact that at your joints, your bones can move relative to each other. Okay. All right. With that said, there are a lot of joints in your body where no movement occurs. Actually, the majority of the joints in your body, there's no movement. We just don't really talk about them just because they're not that interesting. And so, of course, the ones we'll be focusing on in this class are the joints where movement does occur, and those are most of the joints between the major segments of your body. Okay. All right, so joints are really important, and a lot of people when they have problems with their health in terms of they can't move well, more often than not these are diseases at the joints or conditions. And so due to the large amount of movement and just kind of the relative impacts that occur at the joints, these are often sites of a lot of injuries. And so we'll talk a little bit about that today. And so you probably heard of injuries like sprains, like dislocations. So these are all, or even more long-term injuries like arthritis or bursitis. These are all injuries or conditions that occur at the joints. Okay, and so they're frequent source of pain for a lot of people. And the kind of the overall theme that I want to talk about today is a lot of times when we characterize joints, we talk about two main characteristics. Since we talk about their stability and their flexibility. These two concepts, in a lot of ways, are opposites of each other, right? And so a joint that's very stable is often not going to have a lot of flexibility, and a lot of joints that are flexible, usually aren't very stable. But there's some exceptions to that in the body too. So you do have some joints in your body that are both flexible and fairly stable. And we're going to talk about kind of the all the different factors that go into stability and flexibility. Okay. Any questions on this so far? Okay. All right. So let's go through some basics, right? So we'll talk about the types of joints in your body, how we can describe them, and give them some names. Okay. So more vocabulary. That's kind of the theme of just biology in general. Just a lot of vocab, a lot of terms, and so we kind of just have to go through. So let's go through joint. Okay. And so the first kind of classification that we have for joints is based on the amount of movement that is allowed at the joints. Okay. And like I mentioned, earlier, the vast majority of your joints are actually immovable. And so talk about, the joints between your rib bones, for instance, or the joints between your vertebrae. Even though those aren't technically, some of those aren't technically immovable, there's some movement that can be allowed, but for all intents and purposes, they're largely immovable. Okay, and that's actually the first type of joint that we have. So these are called immovable joints. And so these joints basically permit either very little movement or no movement at all between the articulating bones. And the reason that almost no movement is allowed is it's different for every joint, but usually it's a combination of just the geometry or the anatomy in terms of how the bones are kind of inserted into each other. Sometimes they're inserted in a way that kind of just lock up. There's no movement, or there's a lot of either cartilage or ligaments or tendons in that area that just don't allow it. So some examples of immovable joints in your body would be, joints between your rib bones. Okay. The joint between the different plates in your skull. So remember we talked about, your skull isn't just one big bone. It's actually a few different plates all together, but you can't really move them. And there's even, some immovable joints in some areas that you don't expect. So, if we're talking about, the lower arm or the lower leg, remember we talked about there are two bones that make up those. So in your arm, you have the radius and the ulna, and then in your leg, you have the fibula and the tibia. Okay. So those two bones, there's no movement that's allowed between those. But most of the joints in your body are like this. We just don't really talk about them because just because they're not that interesting. All right. And so the second category of joints doesn't have the most clever name, but it is very descriptive. So the second category of joints we call slightly movable joints. I actually appreciate this naming. All too often, and if you haven't before, I always have Greg where scientists will name formulas and things after themselves. And so, slightly movable joint is a better name than like a Johnson joint. What the heck is Johnson? No one cares about you, Johnson. So slightly movable joints, like their name basically describes, they do allow some movement. But the reason we kind of characterize them a bit differently is that these joints have a lot of cartilage, associated with them. And so if you're not familiar with cartilage, you have a lot of different parts of your body are made of cartilage. So your ear is one instance, right? So cartilage is kind of, it's fairly hard. There's some structure to it, but still kind of soft at the same time. Okay? And so when you have cartilage that's kind of stabilizing this joint, it stabilizes it to a large degree, but it still allows a little bit of. And so I think the biggest example for this is actually found in your spine. And so the joints between the vertebrates in your spine, there's some movement, right? So you can kind of arch your back and bend forward, but it's not extreme because there's a lot of cartilage in between the different vertebrate bones in your spine. Right, and the last category of joints, the one that we'll focus on mostly in this class, are the freely movable joints. Right, and so these joints allow a large degree of movement relatively between the articulating movements. So at these joints, these aren't just kind of two bones, just kind of at the joint. So you do have some soft tissue. So oftentimes you're going to see ligaments and tendons at these joints, but you're also going to see some cartilage as well. And so the soft tissue actually plays a very important role at these joints, both for lubrication and also for kind of shock absorption as well. And so it's a little bit different. So you still see soft tissue, but they just kind of play a very different. All right. And so among the freely movable joints, we can kind of further classify this, right? Because even among the joints that do allow a large degree of movement, some joints allow more movement than others, right? So your elbow joint is very different than your hip joint, which is very different than the joint between your fingers, which is very different between your neck joint. Okay, so you can further classify these. So I'm not going to name all of them just because there's a lot. And it's kind of hard to kind of see the big differences between them without pictures. And so I'm just going to name kind of the big categories. Some of these we went over already. All right, so the first type of joint, which is allows the least amount of movement, are the gliding joints. And so these gliding joints, just like the name kind of implies, the bones can kind of glide or slide past each other. Not past each other, relatively. And so the example or kind of where you see these the most are inside your hands, right? So your hand and feet are made of several different bones. Okay, so your hand is not just one big bone, so it's several of them. And they can all move they can all glide relative to each other. And also one more surprising one that I think people don't really think about often is your kneecap. So your kneecap is a gliding joint because it can kind of, it can kind of slide up and down your knee joint, depending on where it's. And your kneecap is called the patella. The second type of movable joint that we'll go over, we'll use a lot in this class is the hinge joint. And so just like the name implies, the movement allowed at this joint is just like a hinge, like what you'd expect from a door, or a handle or a lever. Okay. And so the type of movement that we can say that the hinge joint allows is 1 degree of rotation. Okay. And so you see these quite a bit. And so your elbow joint is one example, your knee joint is another example, the joints in your fingers is another example. Next type of joint is a pivot joint. All right, so similar to the hinge joint, the pivot joint allows a rotational degree of freedom. It's just the axis that it allows is different. Okay. And so just like the hinge, it's going to allow for 1 degree of rotation, but the axis of that rotation is usually parallel to some, adjacent bone. That's in contrast to the hinge joint, where for the hinge joint, the axis of rotation is often perpendicular to an adjacent bone. Okay. right, so one example I think people normally associate with the pivot, it's not completely a pivot joint because it can do other things too. But your neck joint is one good example. It has other properties too, because you can look down, look up, turn your head to the side, but but when you think of an owl, and so if you've ever seen an owl turn its head completely around, that's kind of the best example of a pivot. Okay? Because you're rotating, but the axis of rotation in that case is parallel to your spine. Okay, so there's technically three more types of joints, but they're all very similar. They're only just kind of differentiated in terms of how much movement they have. So I'm just going to kind of group them all together. And so we have condyloid joints. We have saddle joints. And probably the one that people know the most are the ball and socket joints. And compared to all the other types of joints, these are the most flexible. So they can allow for all different kinds of and so some examples of the type of movements that they can allow are flexion, extension, abduction, adduction, circumduction, rotation. Usually for these joints, they don't allow complete range of movement, so they don't allow completely all of these in their full capacity, but it does allow for at least some degree of these movements. And so the most kind of iconic examples of these joints, one is your shoulder joint. And another is your hip joint. And so by hip joint, I mean the joint between your upper leg and your pelvis. Okay. Lots of vocabulary. So you just 20 straight minutes of just new terms. But just know that when you're talking about joints, you're always thinking about how much movement is allowed in joints. And just every joint is just characterized differently based on how much movement you're moving out and the kind of movement. All right. Any questions on this? All right, so let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, which is joint stability. It's one of the main topics. Okay, so let's define joint stability first. So when we talk about the stability of a joint, we're talking about its ability to resist dislocation. Right, and then how do we define dislocations? And so dislocation is when, the bones are kind of separated from each other and they don't, move the way that they do. Okay, so stability is just, you can almost think of it as how strong the joint is. Okay. And so some of the factors that affect joint stability, of course, not every joint in your body is equally stable. You have some joints that are more easy to dislocate than others. Okay. And so some of the factors that affect joint stability are things like the shape of the articulating bones. And when I say shape, what I really mean is, how much contact area do you have between the bones? So I think a great example of this is when we compare, our two ball and socket joints. So if we compare our shoulder joint and our hip joint, hopefully I think that kind of makes it clear how much bone shape affects stability. Okay. So let's look at the hip joint first. So the hip joint is a anatomical marvel, because at the same time, you have a joint that's incredibly flexible, right? And so your hip is capable of a lot of different movements in your body. But at the same time, it's also probably besides all the immovable joints, among the freely movable joints, your hip is probably the most stable. Okay. And what is the reason for it? Well, let's draw out the anatomy. So for the hip joint is the articulation between the femur, which is your thigh bone, and your pelvis. Okay. And so your femur, it's kind of its most defining characteristic is this, we call it the femoral head. So it's this literally like a ball that's at the top of your femur. Okay. Your femur kind of comes in like this. I'm going to exaggerate a little bit just to kind of make the point clear, but you have kind of this big kind of spherical, appendage at the end of your femur. Okay. And if you look at where this kind of attached to your pelvis, your pelvis kind of has like almost a perfect hole for it, on. And so your pelvis is kind of this kind of V-shaped bone. I need your one part of the pelvis because of space. Okay. But when you think of like ball and socket joints, this is the ball and socket, right? And so at the same time, because you have this, that the ball of the femur is in there, you can turn it a lot. But at the same time, because this entrance where the femur fits into the pelvis is so narrow, it's actually really hard to kind of yank that femur out from that joint. And so this is a case where, so this is your hip joint. But here we have kind of lots of contact area, right? So there's a ton of contact between the femur and the pelvis. And so what you have is a very, very stable joint. Okay. So very, very stable. And that kind of matches the eye test, right? And so, unless there's a, of course, it happens, people get into like, car accidents and things like that. But, besides those, you almost never hear people dislocating their hip, just because it's just very, very hard to do. Okay. If you compare that to your shoulder joint. And so your shoulder joint is comprised of two bones. And so we have your upper arm bone, which is the humerus. And so kind of similar to the femur, it does have kind of like a bulbous or spherical head, but it's not nearly as big as the femur. It's kind of more like that. It almost kind of looks like a club, I guess. But I think kind of the more important feature is looking at the bone that the humerus makes contact with, which is your scapula, okay, your shoulder bone. Okay. And so if you look at the geometry of the scapula, there's a part where the humerus attaches to. You can kind of see it if you see kind of pictures of the scapula, but it doesn't form like a deep cavern or a deep kind of socket like the pelvic bone does. Instead of a huge socket, it's more like a little dent. So the scapula kind of comes around just like this. And then what you see there is just kind of a little dent where the humerus attaches. And so when you compare the two, right? So you compare your kind of the socket of the pelvic bone versus in the scapula is called the glenoid fossa. And so if you kind of compare those two, you have way more contact area in the hip joint, and thus giving you much better stability. And so your shoulder joint is very unstable, very flexible, and so you can do a lot of things with your shoulders. But people dislocate their shoulders. I would say, I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but they dislocate their shoulders way more than okay. And you can kind of deduce that. And kind of the point I'm making here is, you can kind of deduce this just by looking at the geometry of the bones. Right, and so if you look at a lot of the other joints in your body, like your knee joint, we're going to talk about the knee joint actually quite a bit today when we talk about ligaments and things like that. But if you just look at the geometry of the joint, you can kind of just tell which joints are going to be more stable. Okay. All right. Any questions on this? Okay. All right, so that's kind of the first, I would say, kind of major factor that affects the joint's stability. Okay. And we didn't have to learn anything about kind of the soft tissues, tendons, ligaments, any of that. Okay, because it's purely based on the geometry of the bones. The second main factor that affects stability is the arrangement of all the soft tissue around it. Cartilage, that's the ligaments, that's the tendons. And some joints in your body really rely heavily on these soft tissues, because the bones themselves, don't really give any advantages for stability. Oh, I forgot to mention one soft tissue. So actually probably the most important one, which is your muscles. Sorry about that. So muscles, cartilage, ligaments, and tendons. And muscles actually play a really important role for some of these choices. Okay. So I think the best example of this, of a joint that relies heavily on its soft tissue, is your knee joint. If you look at the geometry, if you look at the anatomy of your knee joint, it looks like a joint that should not be stable at all. In fact, if it looks like if you didn't have any of the ligaments around there, you'd be able to just kind of push it over very easily. So your knee joint is made up of two bones mostly. And so on the top side we have the femur. And so your femur, of course, is the one that attached to your hip, but we're talking about the bottom part of the femur now. Okay. And so the bottom part of the femur kind of looks like that. Kind of has like kind of two two things that come down just like that. And then the bottom part of your knee joint is comprised of your tibia. And it kind of forms this kind of like a platform almost that kind of comes just like this. And so we call this kind of the tibial plateau. Right? It's almost not completely flat. There's a little bit indentations in the tibia, which is where kind of the femur kind of attaches to, but mostly flat. All right. And I'm separating the distance between these just to exaggerate, but they're normally not that far apart. They're normally close. All right, and so if you look at the geometry of this joint, right, even relative to the shoulder joint, this looks like one that should be very unstable because you have kind of two bones that don't really have any geometrical mechanisms of locking it. Right? And so what gives this joint stability is kind of two things most. And so on the one hand, there's a lot of muscles that kind of wrap around your knee joint. So you have the quadricep muscles, the calf muscles, you have kind of the muscles on the front of your leg that all kind of wrap around it to give it stability. But you also have a very complex network of ligaments. And I don't think we haven't defined ligaments in this class yet. So ligaments are a type of soft tissue in your body where their main purpose is to connect bone to bone. Okay. And their main purpose, or ligaments' main purpose, is to stabilize the joint. And so ligaments you can almost think of as kind of like compensating or making up for lack of kind of geometrical stability. And so your knee joint actually has four main ligaments in there that stabilize. Okay. So if you follow sports to any degree, you've probably heard of quite a few of these ligaments. Right? And so you have two ligaments that are kind of on the outside of your knee. So you have one on the medial side of your knee, which is kind of on the inside of your body, and one on the outside or the lateral surface of it. Okay. Right, so the one on the medial surface is called the MCL. So MCL stands for the medial collateral ligament. And the one on the outside is the LCL. Let me go ahead and define those here. So MCL medial ligament. PCL. Or sorry, LCL. We'll get to the PCL in a second. If you remember our directional terminology that we went over, I think in the second lecture of class, right? Remember, medial is on towards the midline of your body. And so, you know, the inside surfaces of your knee, that's where your MCL is. And lateral is on the away from your midline. So your LCL is on the outside surface. Okay. And then we also have two ligaments on the interior as well. Okay. So one ligament that goes that way, like that. Another one, like that. So those two ligaments in the middle of the knee kind of almost form a cross. Okay. And so the one side we have the ACL. So that is this one. And then this one right here is the PCL. So it's a little bit hard to draw in 2D, but that's if you're looking at it from the front. So we're basically doing a frontal view. That's kind of what it is. All right, so let's go ahead and define these. So ACL is the anterior cruciate ligament. And the PCL is the posterior cruciate ligament. So again, you know, we see our directional terminology come up. So anterior, remember, means towards the front of your body. Okay, so the ACL gets its name because it crosses towards the front of your body. Okay, and then PCL, posterior means towards the back of your body. So it crosses towards the back. Okay, and the cruciate refers to the fact that these two ligaments kind of form a cross. All right, and so if you follow sports, you know, lower leg injuries are very, very common in sports. You know, we'll talk about ankle sprains a little bit later, but I think probably the one that's also very common is a knee sprain. And so when people say they sprain their knee, most of the time, I would say maybe like 70% of the time, they usually mean the MCL. So MCL is probably the most commonly injured knee joint. But you can have injuries to the other ligaments as well. So after the MCL, I would say the most common one after that is probably the ACL. And ACL tears are usually pretty bad. So usually those require some kind of reconstructive surgery. So those are kind of injuries that that'll sideline your favorite athlete for a long time. My dad actually tore his ACL playing basketball, and then he had to get it reconstructed. And he hasn't been the same ever since. It's kind of sad actually. So I remember when I was little, my dad was really active. So he'd run like half marathons. He tore his ACL, and then, you know, since then he's never been the same. So it's tough. It was these types of injuries. All right, any questions on the knee joint and the ligaments? Yeah.
Is it the passive elastic forces from the muscles that actually hold the joint in engagement?
So the muscles add to a lot of the stability for these joints. It's not just the ligaments. And so actually, if you look at the structural, the yield strength for the ligaments, you know, they're pretty low, especially when you compare to kind of more engineering materials. So of course, it kind of varies based on the ligament, but most ligaments, they can only handle a yield stress of about 50 to 150 megapascal. And so actually, what does most of the work and stabilize your knee are actually the muscles that are around. And so that actually brings up an important point because people always tell you when your muscles are fatigued or when you're tired, you shouldn't continue to lift. So this is actually really important for power lifters. So, a lot of injuries actually occur. So when people are doing squats or doing deadlifts, and their muscles are tired, but they're still trying to go for one rep, their muscles don't have the strength anymore to stabilize the joint. And so all that stress suddenly is being put on the ligaments. Actually, that's where a lot of injuries. Very important. So very important, to not to really push yourself when you're tired. All right, any other questions on the ligaments here? Okay. All right. And so those, those are the two, I would say, main anatomical ways that your joints are stabilized. But you can actually I would call those kind of the passive stability. So that's stability that you kind of automatically gain just based on the geometry of the bones and based on the ligaments that are already. There's an active component of stability too. So there are actually things that you can actively do to stabilize your joints. And just like we talked about with the muscles, some of these things you do kind of naturally, just kind of based on intuition. All right. And so number 3, I don't really have a name for this, but we'll call it, I would say, active positioning of the joints. All right. And so with the two, with those two kind of factors in mind, there are some things that you can do at your joints to make them more stable. Most notably, you can kind of actively use your muscles to kind of push the joints together. Because there are some positions that your body, when you can put your body in to give your joints more stability than others. And as an example, let's talk about the ankle. And so more so than the knee, your ankle is probably the most injured joint in your entire body. So, probably everyone's had an ankle sprain at some point in their life. If you played sports, certainly you've probably had an ankle joint. But even just walking, I've just been walking around my house, and all of a sudden, I don't know, I just derp out and I sprain my ankle like that. It's happened, more times than I think to admit. But the ankle is very easy to injure. Okay? But with that said, there are certain things that you can do at your ankle to decrease the probability of you getting injured. So let's look at 2, I would say, main positions of the ankle. So let's look at dorsiflexion. So let's look at the position where you're kind of pointing your toes towards the sky. And then let's look at the opposite of dorsiflexion. So let's look at plantar flexion, where you're kind of pointing your toes towards the ground. All right, so here comes another terrible drawing by me, but I think the drawing will help to illustrate this. This person has the biggest foot in the world and the skinniest ankle in the world. You get the idea. Okay. So dorsiflexion, you're pointing towards the sky. Plantar flexion. All right, so what scientists have noticed is that, you know, when you look at kind of people getting ankle injuries or spraining their ankles, a lot of times it happens in the plantar flexion, or it's more likely to occur in plantar flexion. Okay. And so scientists did a study, and so they took a bunch of people in the lab, and what they measured was the amount of contact area between your foot bone and your fibula in those two positions. Okay, and so what they found was that in dorsiflexion across all the people that they measured, the average amount of contact area was around 7.34 plus or minus 1.69 centimeters squared. And then they measured the same again, and so I believe they did this with X-rays, and so they simply just took X-rays of people doing dorsiflexion and plantar flexion. And so when the foot's in plantar flexion, what they found was the contact area was around 4.39 centimeters squared, with roughly the same spreads. And so based on what we know about contact area, you know, you can kind of see what, right? And so, and let's think about this intuitively too, right? When you're kind of pointing your toes up towards the sky in dorsiflexion, you're using the muscles on the front of your leg to kind of almost pull your foot back towards your butt, right? And so it kind of makes sense that you're kind of pulling, you know, you're kind of pulling the joint towards you, so you're kind of almost pushing the joint together, thus giving you more stability. Okay. Whereas in plantar flexion, you know, you're kind of using your calf muscles to point your foot down. You're almost kind of, you know, not completely, but you're kind of almost, you know, pointing the foot away from your leg. Okay, thus giving you less stability. Right? And these measurements and kind of just what we kind of observe kind of lines up. All right, so we have a term for these two types of positions, and so this is not the only joint in your body that can do this. And so whenever you use your muscles to kind of bring the bones closer together, to kind of pack it together, we call this a closed pack position. And so a closed pack position is one where you kind of give the joint more stability based on its position. And the opposite is a loose pack position. And then besides this too, there are other things that you can do to stabilize the joint. And so if you apply some kind of external force to the joint, and so like say to like stabilize your shoulder joint, I can take my arm and kind of push it against the wall right here. Okay. So that's applying an external force to push the bones together. Right. So kind of same idea as this. And so basically anything that you can do to push the bones together, either through your muscles internally or through any kind of external force, you know, those are things that you can do to kind of actively stabilize a joint. Right. Any questions on active or dynamic stability? Okay. All right, so for the last 15 minutes of class today, let's talk about the opposite of stability, which is flexibility. Okay. And so opposite of stability, when we talk about flexibility, we're talking about the range of motion or the amount of motion that's allowed at the joint. And this kind of goes beyond the type of joint that the joint is, right? So of course, your shoulder joint is going to have a greater degree of range of motion than your elbow, right? And that's just natural, right? And so when we talk about flexibility, what we actually are describing is, the same joints, but just relative to other people, right? And so we talk about how flexible your elbow is, that's relative to, someone else's elbow. Usually. So this is something that's typically measured. So if you do any kind of physical therapy, or if you go to the doctor for an injury, this is something that they're going to measure. It's a usually good indication of how injured your joint is, or how it's a good indicator of your physical fitness as well. Okay. All right, so there's two types of flexibility that's typically measured. And so we have static flexibility. And so static flexibility refers to the range of motion that's possible when your bone or when your body segment is moved by some external agent. Okay. So usually this is some doctor, some physical therapist, or even even your friend. Okay. And usually your static flexibility is going to be greater than your dynamic flexibility, which is the other one. Okay. Just because it's kind of easier to get your body in certain positions when you have someone pushing it for you. Okay. All right. And the other one is dynamic flexibility. So dynamic flexibility is the range of motion possible when your body is moved just by its own muscles. So both are important factors. Oftentimes for most joints, these two kind of give you different. All right. So those are the different types of flexibility. And so now, the question becomes, how do we actually measure? Okay. And so flexibility, remember when we say that a joint is moving relative to the other, most of the time it's some kind of rotation. Okay? So if we have a hinge joint, we want to measure how much we can rotate. Or even a ball and socket joint, we can measure rotations all the different planes. Okay. And so kind of the clinical measurement for flexibility is actually degrees or radians. Usually it's degrees. There's only the psychopathic ones use radians. Those are usually the ones with an engineering background. There's not that many of us. Okay. And so how it's usually measured is that they usually start the body in some kind of rest position, or a position that's comfortable for the person. And then what the doctor, what the clinician, or what the physical therapist will do is that they'll kind of move your body part as much as it can, and then the amount of movement that it was able to go or from its resting motion or resting position, that's how we characterize range of motion. Okay. So let me draw a diagram that kind of shows you how hip flexion is, or hip flexion range of motion. Okay. And so when you're measuring flexion at the hip, you're going to start from a resting position. And so the typical resting position is just someone just laying on their back with their two legs kind of straight. It looks something like this. This resting position. Laying on your back, your two legs kind of out straight, parallel. All right, from here, and you can test either static flexibility or dynamic flexibility. What you're going to do then is you're going to raise your leg up as far as it can go. Okay. So this person can raise it up this much. The other leg, of course, is still on the ground. And so we're flexing at the hip. Okay. And so this angle here, and so if you draw one line kind of down the parallel with the femur, okay, of the raised leg, and you draw another line kind of parallel to the femur of kind of where it started. Okay. This angle right here, that describes your range of motion. or your flexibility. So this is maximally. All right, and then you can do similar tests for other parts of your body. But kind of the point here is that you start from a resting position, start from something that's comfortable, and then try to kind of flex or kind of move the joint as much as you can, and just whatever angle that you make there, that's how you measure flexibility. Okay, and of course, this is different for everyone. Everyone has different degrees of flexibility. Part of it is due to the muscles, but part of it's also due to just just how your bones are, the anatomy of. All right, any questions on flexibility, range of motion here? Okay. All right, so flexibility in a lot of ways, you can kind of think of it as the opposite of stability, right? And so joints that are very flexible are often more prone to injury. Okay? Flexibility is not opposite of flexibility. More range of motion. Usually increases risk of. That's not always the case, and so there are joints in your body that have a large range of motion, but are still relatively stable. A la the hip joint is one great example. Okay. And so the factors, all the factors that affect stability are also going to affect flexibility as well. And so that includes the shape of the bones, that includes the arrangement of the soft tissue, all of that stuff. Okay, and so all those things can affect joint flexibility as well. But another factor that affects flexibility is actually the relative, I would say, laxity or relative kind of extensibility of the collagen, muscles, and other soft tissue that cross the joint. Right, and so when people say that they're stretching, or when you're stretching at a joint, you're stretching your muscle. What you're actually doing is you're kind of increasing kind of the extensibility or the flexibility of the collagen and muscles, right? So you're not actually changing the bone shape, right? Just kind of loosening up all of those. All right. Let's see. Let me just mention one thing. All right, and so we just kind of finished talking about how if you have too much flexibility or too much range of motion, that can put you at risk for injury, right? And so that's true at your shoulder joint. But actually, if your flexibility is too low, then that can actually put you at risk of injury as well. So if your flexibility at a joint is kind of abnormally low, so it's low relative to maybe your own previous range of motion or maybe someone else's, right? That could mean that a lot of the muscles and collagen and soft tissue around the joint are very stiff and almost very brittle. And just like what we expect with any kind of brittle material, right? It doesn't have a lot of flexibility. It can't really displace much. And so if you kind of all of a sudden kind of try to move it a lot, you could risk, tearing muscles, tearing soft tissue, things like that. And so, there's kind of a sweet spot of flexibility or sweet spot of range of motion that your joints can have, that kind of puts you at the best position to not get injured. All right, any final questions on this before we wrap it up for today? Okay, all right, and so today, that's the last, pure biology lecture, and so, starting on Wednesday, we're going to review mechanics, force balance, moment balance, three-body diagrams, that happen on lots for our next big unit, which is adding biomechanics. All right, thank you guys for coming today. I hope you guys enjoy the rest of your day. I guess. Good day. You pointed out as soon as I heard it. We didn't see it. Good. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
We have a question.
Sure.
A lot of times when we talk about joint movement and we often refer to something called joint stiffness as to how compliant the joint is to external forces. So does that depend on muscular forces that are holding a joint in position? How left it there?
Yes, that's definitely part of it, because the muscles, the muscles can do a lot of things. So on the one hand, the muscle can kind of, pack the joint close together. But I think what's more important is that the muscles can help resist. I call these kind of the weak knees. So I think the knee is kind of a good example. So your knee generally is but what happens a lot is your knee is kind of just side, and it kind of forces the knee to kind of but it's not comfortable. And so the thing that kind of stabilizes the joint there is actually the muscles. Right. So you have your muscles, most of the muscles, your ligaments help a little bit too. And so it kind of helps to, so that it doesn't move in ways that it doesn't expect.
Right. Yeah. And also I think one more thing that you're talking about is the slight movability of joints. So does that also mean that certain joints, when they have like a passive degree of freedom, right? Like for example, if I'm trying to grasp something spherical with my hand, my fingers don't just bend as hinges, they also slightly turn in degrees of freedom that we cannot actively control.
Exactly. Yeah.
So does that also play an important role in how compliant the joint is?
Yes, it does. It does. And I think that's one thing that's really hard to replicate with robotics too.
Yes.
Because for robotics, you're talking about mechanical parts, their degrees are very, very well defined.
Right.
But for the body, we can characterize the elbow as like a hinge joint, but there's still a little bit of like kind of wiggle in the other direction too. And that actually adds a lot of movement and a lot of flexibility.
Actually, I came across a lot of papers that are trying to replicate the motion in the human hand.
Yeah.
And I think they just try to go towards something that's a lot more bio-inspired. specifically for this purpose because there are a lot of passive degrees of freedom that we don't really
Exactly.
control actively.
Hand is really hard. That's why, like, like when you talk to people outside of robotics, it's, I mean, for us, it's a big deal to have a hand grab something. But for people, I was like, oh, that's not impressive.
Yeah.
It's really impressive. Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, especially considering the different geometry and how it relates to the function. Like you won't grasp a hammer the same way you would grasp a screwdriver.
Exactly.
So that's
Exactly.
a lot that goes on.
Yeah, for sure.
It's a really great lecture. I'm looking forward to the math stuff, but this is like completely new for me.
Yeah.
And it actually is giving a lot of perspective about how to approach a lot of this.
That's good. I'm glad you like it. Yeah. See you Wednesday.
Yes, yes.
Like what he was talking about, because
Of course.
you have to control the amount of force that you apply. Like if you're trying to pick up an egg with a prosthetic robotic arm, if you apply too much force.
Exactly. Yeah. That's another thing that our body does really well is just like active feedback. Like we can tell when we're kind of gripping things too hard, and we can kind of instantaneously kind of adjust how much force that we do. That's very, very difficult to do with robotics for sure.
Yeah, it's just something that I wanted to mention, but probably way beyond the scope of this class. But
Okay.
so I have this, I think she's probably like very close to 18-year-old dog, and she has a lot of problems like severe arthritis and whatnot.
Uh-huh.
And Cushing's disease has caused her rear legs muscles to atrophy
Uh-huh.
and severe patellar luxation on the right arm leg.
Uh-huh.
It's so bad that the kneecap is completely out of position.
Gosh.
It sounds terrible, but the biggest problem that we have is like outside, on cement, on coarse cement, she's able to, kind of hobble and kind of drag herself around, but inside the house with slippery floors, she cannot, she can't really get up anymore.
Yeah, because you need a lot of that, like kind of like we talk like kind of lateral stability that your muscles can afford, that that in order to move on surfaces like that.
And I was wondering, is there any way to like, because I know like there's this veterinarian that came up with these, they call them toe grips, where you put like kind of like rubber, they look like tiny little rubber bands that fit on their nails to try to create more stability, but like if there's already like irreversible like muscle atrophy and limitations of weight bearing, and plus the pain that like we can't imagine or characterize what kind of pain she's under, like when she actually gets up and is moving around. Like, is there a way to like, I'm wondering if there's a way to like, I know you can probably attach sensors and whatnot to her legs and then measure like the weight distribution, like once she's actually upright and is able to stand, but I'm wondering if there's anything that can be done, like to like come up with something to like improve her like posture, or to kind of like reduce the load off of, or to kind of rebalance the load. I know that they have wheelchairs and stuff, but then you create another problem where they can't go to the bathroom because they can't squat.
Yeah. There's no easy fix to that. I mean, anything that you could do to kind of take some load off your muscles. And so, the toe grips actually does help, or anything that can like, improve the friction, between her paws and the floor. Because when you're kind of slipping and sliding, your muscles actually do a lot of work trying to compensate to kind of stabilize yourself. And so if you have kind of a very stable base with kind of, something that, your foot's not going to slip, that actually helps a lot, because then your muscles aren't doing as much to kind of stabilize you. And that can kind of help you. You're not falling over, you don't have to exert as much work to kind of move around. It's like you can imagine, like, if this floor were made of ice, we had to like go from here to there, that would take a lot of work, because we're slipping and we're kind of trying to stabilize ourselves. But the fact that it's not a big deal to walk from here to there is because we know that our feet aren't going to slip and our muscles won't have to do that much work. But then beside that, there's external supports that you can do, like a wheelchair or something like that, like wheels. I've seen kind of smaller wheelchairs for pets that have their legs amputated, things like that. But then there's other issues with that as well. But anything that you can do to kind of just limit the amount of work that the muscles have to do. Maybe even just kind of other things too, like making sure your toilet's close by, or food's close by, water's close by, just so they don't have to move so much. Anything like that helps.
Because I'm wondering if maybe I'll look into it. Maybe they might. So besides the little toe grips, I'm wondering if they have one like a slip-on boot that like the whole, like, do they have those?
Yeah, I'm sure they do. I mean, they have. I've seen dogs wear like shoes outside, like when the pavement's really hot. And so they put those little booties on their paws, just so that they're not contacting up on the boot. So I'm sure they have ones, you know, for every size dog, and if they don't have like a rubbery grip, you can probably just attach them to it, and then that'll definitely help. Or even something you can do around the house, just like having, I'm probably sure you do, just have mats, which, you know, so that she's not slipping on kind of on the hard floor, so it kind of gives her like a bathroom. And so, you know, like I think what you'll see for a lot of kind of elderly people in their bathtub or shower, there's a kind of grippy mat, so they're not, they know it reduces the risk of them falling. It's kind of sticky to their feet, so you probably get some of those around the house too. Yeah, because I know for animals, and at least this is true for cats, because I have 2 cats at home, that, you know, they rely on kind of their feet, the kind of the tactile feedback from the feet. And so actually, if you put shoes on them, it's actually very disorienting. It kind of takes away one of their senses. Like a mat may be a better idea. Just so their paws are still free, but it's, you know, the mat can help them to not slip. But of course, you know, you can't control where they move, and so if, you know, if they move offside the mat, then you can't really, you know, that doesn't really help.
Because we have this huge carpet in the living room, and sometimes we roll it up because unfortunately they treat it as a giant pee pad.
Oh, yeah.
But when we have it out, yeah, she even surprises, like she actually got up and actually was able to start walking.
Okay, that's good.
But once she gets going, then she's fine. But then, you know, she can't walk very far before, you know, the rear legs give out, and she just falls. But
You said she's 18.
very close. We don't know the exact age, but very close, or if not at 18. Yeah. So yeah, she's exceeded her lifespan.
For sure. I was gonna say, you must have given her a great life to live that long. So.
Yeah, and she's still going, but you know, it's not the same anymore. She doesn't, like, you know, you can see, I guess, like they call it canine cognitive dysfunction, aka dog dementia, where she'll go into a corner and she can't get out. She just, you know, stay there, and then she'll go around and around in circles, and then sometimes she'll pee or poop, and then she'll come around, and then right after, and then she'll smell it, and like as if, you know, it's something new. And so little things like that, you know, it's like very gradual over a long period of time. You kind of almost don't even notice it until like you start reading about it. Oh, okay, well, that's what it is. But because
What kind of dog is she?
she's a Pomeranian.
Okay. Oh, yeah, Pomeranians live a long time. And my good friend had a Pomeranian that lived, like, I think, close to 15 years.
Oh wow.
It was funny. We that dog, I think she also kind of suffered from dementia a little bit too.
Oh, yeah.
And so she would just angrily bark at anything. Like my friend will walk into the room and it'll be like a stranger to her. So she's like, ah!
Yeah, that's how they were
Yeah.
when they were younger. But as they got older, that kind of went away. But it lives there.
Oh, what a cutie. What's her name?
Sam.
Sandy. Very cute.
Yeah. Very very rambunctious in the morning, like around 6 a.m.
Of course.
Dogs are really I don't know, this is something that started recently. Like before she wasn't like, you know, didn't demand her food, but now it's like, I think because of the Cushing's, and we're giving her this medication, which comes with a really expensive, you have to monitor their cortisol levels.
Okay.
And it's actually, it's like $400 test, and
Oh my gosh.
yeah, like
Wow.
every time. And so like we had to do it before that confirmed that she does have it. Now 2 weeks later, and now we have to do it a month later. So yeah, it gets really expensive, but
Oh my gosh.
we were hoping that it would kind of curb her appetite, because, you know, too much appetite is a symptom, or yeah, a cause symptom of disease. And we were hoping that it would curb her appetite, but no, like within like sometimes she's off by an hour, but it's crazy how dogs are really good at like routine. Like they know more or less, like they might be off by about an hour, but very close to, like, you know, they know when they're gonna get fed.
Yeah. their biological clock. knows,
Yeah.
Oh, it's time for
And then
food.
she'll keep barking. Like, okay, well, now this is my new alarm clock.
Always at 6 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, starting around 6:30. But yeah, it's difficult to have them on the dog. Kind of like older people.
Yeah.
Although I mean, there's a huge range of, like, some people that, like, they're in their 90s, and you know, they look and move around like as if they were not a day older than 80.
Yeah.
But there's people like in their late 70s that are, like, you know, are in bad shape. So yeah, there's a huge range of, you know, like mobility
Yeah, for
and
sure.
also the mental sharpness.
Oh, for sure.
But,
But 18 years for a dog is really, I mean, 18 years for any pet is really good. So
yeah,
must take really good care of her.
yeah, we have I mean, we've done the best that we can. I mean, there's only so much you can do, but I guess genes play a you know an important role in
Certainly, yeah.
yeah, because you know sometimes don't make it because of cancer or other things that you know not have a lot of it. But yeah, I mean, we're kind of hoping she makes it to 20s, but that'd be cool. The oldest Pomeranian on record was 21 years
Wow.
and something months, but and then they had this. I think the world record right now for the oldest dog was like 30 years or something.
That's crazy. That's almost as old as me.
Yeah, and the weirdest thing is they fed them like human food.
What the heck?
Yeah,
Wow.
they just washed up the seasonings.
Yeah. Oh, okay.
Crazy. Because I mean like the dogs that we have at home and her children too, they're super sensitive at this age. They get pancreatitis and then it gets really like then we have to put them on a low fat diet and so a lot of dogs like I'm surprised that that dog is like it's kind of almost like immune to like you know eating you know all these different kinds of food and nothing happens to them.
Wow.
It's crazy because some dogs are super sensitive, you know.
Yeah. I've heard of that. I know some people only feed their dogs like chicken breast they got from the market or something like that. Like they won't buy like prepared dog. They have to prepare it like that. It's called like a live food diet or something like that. Some people swear by it.
It does make a difference because the other dog that we got not too long ago, she was eating Purina
Yeah.
and her poops were smelly.
Oh, I see.
Well, then we switched over to digest food for dogs.
Yeah.
It's actually not that much more expensive than the canned food.
Yeah.
And a big difference in like and food. So I guess the poop is in the food, right?
Yeah.
But, yeah, it's made a big difference.
Okay.
I guess there is something like I mean to get like human grade food. The only thing that sucks about it is it's so frozen, so you have to defrost it.
Oh yeah.
Kind of a pain of like defrost it and then section it out.
Yeah, yeah.
Measure like how many ounces you have to feed and
Yeah, my friend does that for their dog. And yeah, they say the same thing. Yeah, they tried a bunch of other foods that the dog would just throw up or like poop was not really bad. So yeah, they have to get the frozen fresh food. So
yeah. But it's good because it's not that much more expensive and you kind of have like you can feed them a variety of different, have variety of food stuff. And you can even make it yourself if you really have the time.
oh yeah.
But who has the time to do that?
Yeah, that takes a lot of work.
Yeah, it's a lot of work. But yeah, they even have they come with the supplement that you add onto the food to make it complete and then you can make it yourself. They give you the recipe. It's pretty cool, but yeah, it does make a difference. Some people, really swear by it. Other people like, I don't know, but so far, I mean, it's been pretty good.
I think we should get out of here.
Yeah,
I think that's fine.
All right, next time.
Yep. Have a good day.
Whoa.
Hey. Sorry, it's